Join me in welcoming my colleague Lee Edwards. Lee?
Well, thank you, John. And before I do anything else, I want to recognize who is with us today, Annette Kirk, the widow of Russell Kirk, who continues with the Russell Kirk Foundation and Institute out in Mecosta, Michigan. Annette, would you please? Annette, through the Kirk Center, keeps the spirit and the mind of Russell Kirk going, and she does a marvelous job. Well, here in Washington and across the land, you can hear the cry. The libertarians are coming. The libertarians are coming. And indeed they are, evidenced by the political appeal of Senator Rand Paul, the intellectual pull of Ayn Rand, and the insightful policy analysis of Cato and the Reason Foundation. That may be the first time anybody has ever said that about Cato here at Heritage, but I'm going to say it. And yet, here are three of the leading intellectuals in America, left or right, gathered to discuss a 60-year-old book, The Conservative Mind, and whether it has relevance for 21st century conservatives and Americans. And before introducing our esteemed panel, I just want to make a few points about the enduring importance of the conservative mind. Now, Heritage knew and respected Russell, the author of The Conservative Mind. Dr. Kirk, in fact, lectured at Heritage over 40 times, and that is more than any other outside speaker in the Foundation's history. In truth, the conservative movement was a movement without a name until Russell Kirk published The Conservative Mind. The book stunned complacent liberals who had concluded with Lionel Trilling that conservatism could express itself only in what he called irritable mental gestures. And the book brought up short, pessimistic conservatives like Whittaker Chambers, who believed he had joined the losing side. Before The Conservative Mind, Bill Buckley called himself an individualist in his best-selling book, God and Man at Yale. But 2 years after the publication of The Conservative Mind, Bill Buckley declared in the first issue of his new magazine that National Review would be, quote, a vigorous and incorruptible journal of conservative opinion. The social scientist Robert Nisbet wrote Kirk that with one book, he had done the impossible, broken the cake of intellectual opposition to the conservative tradition in the United States. Our first panelist this afternoon is Yuval Levin, who is the Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and the recipient of a 2013 Bradley Prize. Mr. Levin is a prolific author, editor, essayist, and commentator whose latest book, due out later this year, is The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left. Our next panelist is Dr. Matthew Spalding, whom I would have introduced as our Dr. Spalding until 2 weeks ago. He is now Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs at Hillsdale College, and it's a measure of Dr. Spalding's national reputation that Hillsdale was obliged to give him 2 distinguished positions to bring him on board. He is the best-selling author of We Still Hold These Truths and the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. Peter Weiner is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, widely recognized as a leading educator and practitioner of first principles. I can't improve on what Forbes magazine said about Peter, a gentle giant of a thinker at the intersection of politics and policy. And now I would like to turn to our first panelist, Yuval.
Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you to Heritage for having me, for having us, and for having this chance to reflect on the importance of Kirk and of this extraordinarily important book. Rereading this seminal book with its 60th anniversary in mind, I was naturally inclined to look for what has made it important, for what made it a founding document of the modern conservative movement, and so for elements that mark the beginning of something that we have since seen develop and grow. But actually, the most striking thing to me in reading it again is how current a lot of it feels. The conservative movement has obviously matured a lot since 1953, when it barely existed at all. Matured as an intellectual movement, as a political movement, as a governing movement. And in many respects that has happened thanks to Kirk and his efforts. But some of the key intellectual challenges remain. And especially what was a defining challenge taken up in this book, the challenge of understanding our own political tradition and the place of conservatism in it, as a kind of unfamiliar variant of liberalism that still offers us the opportunity to address some of the excesses of our time while making the most of America's virtues and strengths. In describing that possibility, that thread of our tradition waiting to be recovered, Kirk relied heavily, as he acknowledged, on his understanding of Edmund Burke and Burke's place in the Anglo-American tradition. And so I want to say a few words about Burke and Kirk, about one's understanding of the other, and what Russell Kirk did with that in this extraordinary book and beyond it. His use of Edmund Burke in this book can be summed up in a single short sentence from the book's second chapter. He writes, quote, "Burke was a liberal because he was a conservative." In that very compact insight is contained the germ of the grand alternative that Russell Kirk thought conservatives could offer America. Burke defended English liberties, human liberties, Kirk writes, quote, "not because they were innovations discovered in the age of reason, but because they were ancient prerogatives guaranteed by immemorial usage." In other words, what Kirk had in mind to offer as a political teaching or a political idea was not an alternative to the liberal society, but an alternative understanding of the origins and therefore of the character of our liberal society. In this, he certainly very much followed Burke himself, as he readily acknowledged and proclaimed. Burke's great conservative innovation was the assertion that the liberal society was not a break from the classical tradition of the West, made possible by discoveries in the Enlightenment that allowed for shocking new insights into human equality and liberty, but rather that liberal society was an extension, a continuous extension of the classical traditions of the West, made possible by the gradual evolution of especially the English Constitution. Burke and his opponents, the great conservative and the great radicals of the Age of Revolutions, both celebrated the liberal character of England's institutions and political practices. Both celebrated the rights of Englishmen and their liberties and their virtues, but they differed about what that liberal society was. The radicals argued that liberal institutions were the result of a discovery of new political principles in the Enlightenment, principles that pointed toward new ideals and forms and toward a kind of ideal society. Liberalism, in this view, was the pursuit of that ideal society. Burke argued that liberal institutions were the product of countless generations of political and cultural evolution in the West, which by the time of the Enlightenment, and especially in Britain, had begun to arrive at political forms that pointed toward some timeless principles in which our common life had to be grounded, that accounted for the complexities of society and that allowed for a workable balance between freedom and effective government, given the constraints of human nature, which were permanent. Liberalism, in this view, involves the preservation and the gradual improvement of those forms, because they allow us both to grasp the proper principles of politics and to govern ourselves well. One view, therefore, understood liberalism as a discovery that pointed beyond the existing arrangements of society and politics, and the other saw it as an accomplishment to be preserved and enhanced. One was therefore progressive and the other conservative. These two views, a progressive liberalism and a conservative liberalism, were very much alive and evident in the era of the American founding. You might think of them as the two halves of the Declaration of Independence, the one laying out stark principles to justify revolution, and the other laying out discrete grievances that amount to a demand to be permitted to retain the rights of Englishmen and the forms of the English Constitution. Burke gave voice better than anyone to the conservative strand of that liberal tradition in that age, the one that rejected the notion that modern liberty had to involve a stark break from the traditions of the West. It is a strand of liberalism that's persisted long after the era of the founding, but that since Burke has never had as great an articulator, and so has rarely been well understood as a theory of the liberal society. Even conservatives, too often when reaching for a theory, have reached instead for the radical theory, for the stark extremism of the Enlightenment radicals, a theory that in its radical individualism and rejection of generational obligations and of the value of tradition is just not adequate to how we live, to what human societies really are. And the absence of a theory of conservative liberalism is very much apparent now. We conservatives embody a lot of what Burke stood for and what Russell Kirk celebrated and tried to preserve. But when we want to turn philosophical, we often reach for the radical side of Jefferson or for Paine or others, for theories that abstract away from family and community and society to a stark, lone, naked individual and try to work from there. These theories are not useless, of course, or even quite wrong, but they're incomplete, and so they're very inadequate to the task that we assign them. Kirk tried to do something about that. He tried to reinvigorate that conservative liberal tradition by recovering and rediscovering it and giving it some coherence that could tell a story that we were missing. I think he did that in an extraordinarily important and effective way. It's worth pointing out some ways, too, in which I do think he might have gone too far in the direction he was pursuing, and so that we might think of correctives for in our own following of Kirk. He, first of all, in some respects, I think, went too far in dismissing philosophical principles in politics. His Burke is much more anxious to extirpate all theory from politics than Burke himself was, and so his conservatism is at times too vague about principles and maybe too expedient. He went too far also in turning conservatism into a disposition, and so leaving too little of its practical mindedness and its interest in politics and policy intact. And he went too far in separating conservative liberalism from the principle of human equality, I think, a principle that Burke certainly did not reject and even championed in his own way, and which has been absolutely central to the American version of the conservatism that Kirk wanted and did so much to recover. That he went too far on that front is evidenced by the list of successors to Burke that he takes up in this wonderful book, especially the Americans among them. Adams and Hamilton are there, and Randolph and Calhoun, and Brownson and Hawthorne. But where's Lincoln? Not much praised or blamed in this book, and certainly not given a place in the pantheon. I think Lincoln actually offers Kirk a lot to work with, and Kirk's kind of project, the sort of conservatism he was trying to recover, would help us understand Lincoln's profound conservatism in a way that would be very useful to us now. I think it is actually a form of just the kind of conservatism he was looking for. That kind of conservatism, which sees itself as conserving and developing the ideas and forms of our own political tradition, using the best of what we are to address the worst of what we are, is an approach we badly need today. Its relative absence has created a vacuum filled by an approach to American history and political thought that has some serious problems, particularly as a foundation for conservative thinking. American life has long been better than the theories we've had about it. It's always evinced a very rich and thick conception of civil society, as Kirk understood so well, of all that stands between the individual and the state. It's always advanced in practice a profound understanding of the way in which equality and liberty can be balanced. But the theories we have of ourselves are just too thin, too abstract and simple to explain our actual way of life. What Kirk was trying to tell us was that there is another way to understand ourselves, a way no less rooted in our common history, and in fact in many ways far more so, a conservative liberalism that does not accept the notion that the liberal society was an invention of radicals inspired by the hyper-rationalism of Enlightenment science and politics, a conservatism that sees a direct and uninterrupted path from the origins of our civilization in Jerusalem and Athens and Rome through the history of Christian Europe and into the modern age of liberty, equality, and prosperity. And so that allows us to understand our extraordinary society as the culmination of a long process of development, rather than as a break from all that came before, that allows us to see that our fathers were not fools. It is a conservatism that allows us to see how individual liberty and economic liberty are directly connected to our desire for community and to our cultural and religious traditions, how social and economic conservatism, we would say now, hold together. A conservatism that compels us to respect the past and be concerned for the future, rather than spending down the capital accumulated for us by others and leaving only a terrible mess for those who will follow us. That's the vision of conservatism that has long united and driven the American right. It's a vision that owes an enormous amount to Russell Kirk and to this extraordinary book, which is today as powerful and relevant as ever. So again, thank you for the opportunity to appreciate it and to think it through again.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Thank you to Heritage. I'm actually very happy to be here. This is my first time here, coming from Hillsdale across the street, but I'm very happy to stay here and still be associated with Heritage as the Henry Salvatore Visiting Fellow. And my best to Annette. I was trying to remember when it was that we first met. It was at Mecosta when I also met Russell, and I have since come to appreciate him and his work. And with these two gentlemen on either side of me, I think it's no coincidence we're here. We all, I think, broadly would be considered to be part of what we might call reform conservatism, a category, in an odd way, I would put Russell Kirk. Kirk, of course, was a traditionalist, by which he meant those ideas of prescriptive social habits, prejudices and customs, political usages, which most people accept with little question. And it gives a certain authority to those things and a presumption in their favor. But that does not imply, which his critics often held against him, that he was opposed to change in itself, or that he favored a romantic longing for a lost golden age, some sort of rigid resistance to all change to come. He favored reform in the context of a sound tradition. And the idea was that tradition must be balanced by a strong element of curiosity and individual dissent, to quote Russell. That, of course, is the job of the statesman, to both preserve on the one hand and to reform at the same time. When to preserve and when to reform, of course, is the great question. That's the task of prudence, which Kirk recognized as an arch virtue of politics in the great classical tradition, of political wisdom relating circumstances to principles, some unchanging point of reference, what Kirk might have called the permanent things. His great contribution, it seems to me, was at a time of great confusion, the seeming triumph of liberalism, the almost disappearance of conservatism. He began the pursuit of ideas that, along with a very few other prominent thinkers, led to a conservative renaissance later in the 80s, and despite our current intra-conservative debates, I think laid the groundwork for an intellectually healthy place of conservative thought today. We can thank Kirk for many things. You've all given a wonderful presentation. To that, I would add some particular things he writes about, which I have come to appreciate. One is his very healthy understanding of human nature, seeing man as a very flawed creature with a proclivity towards his own selfishness and arbitrariness, which, of course, demanded a call for restraint and the wisdom to restrain. He also writes, taking the term from Burke, but using it in his wonderful writings about the concept of moral imagination as an alternative to the more radical ideas of rationalism, this intuitive power to perceive ethical truths in the midst of what seems to be chaos. It was that thing that elevated a man above the beasts. And of course, all those things gave rise to his understanding of individualism. On the one hand, he was a great critic of excessive growth of centralized government. It's wrong to criticize him of being soft on that. He thought government and society, however, ought to serve man's civilized objectives. He strongly opposed, and wrote quite eloquently, and pithily, I would say, against atomistic individualism. He favored a sense of community, of moral norms, the things that were the basis of truly civilized existence. In laying those things out, and in this monumentally important book, Kirk drew conservatism away from what was then the dominant impulse of conservatism, which was its utilitarian individualistic sense that had dominated what we might call conservatism for the early 20th century. Here you can think of thinkers like Spencer and what we later refer to as kind of laissez-faire conservatism. Itself a result of progressive thinking, but something I think he saw as a potential problem. and instead he turned conservatism towards a more a set of ideas rooted in community and cultural norms. And in doing so, he began a search which really defines modern conservatism, meaning post-war modern conservatism. He began a search to reconsider a proper tradition to which we should turn. He clearly takes a point of reference in Burke, but he wants to look back to, and he's looking for how you ground that in the American tradition. And he grapples with the thought of those founders. But I do say begin because Kirk himself, I think, moves in his thinking on that. And I think that both in terms of critics of Kirk and those who praise him, going back and reading this book again and his other works as a student years later, I see much more there that shows his influence and also a very fertile mind thinking through these various questions. To back up a moment, at the beginning of the 20th century, American politics, by which I mean politics, but also our intellectual debate about America, comes to be dominated by the progressives. They conquer politically, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, but more importantly, they really dominate the intellectual teaching, the academies, the new universities, and what they taught about America. Where in the midst of that are the conservatives? Well, there were some, not many, but some that look back to the old Federalist Whig interpretation of the Constitution. Justice Stephen Field, Elihu Root, the senator, President, later Chief Justice William Howard Taft. But these were legal thinkers, massively outnumbered and usually defensive in their arguments about rights and limited government. This was by and large because they were not quite sure what the progressives were up to yet. It was too soon. Then there were those who didn't agree with the progressive policies, but agreed with progressive philosophy. A chief example of that is Charles Sumner, sometimes pointed to as a conservative thinker. But Sumner, a follower of Darwin and Herbert Spencer, agreed with the progressive assumptions about man's evolutionary nature. Sumner was opposed to abstraction because he did not believe in absolutes. That is, he didn't believe in much of anything. He was a relativist. Then there were some other social critics, very important social critics. Think of Henry Adams, who warned about the progressives' radical turn to democracy, and the new humanists like Irving Babbitt, who mounted criticisms of the liberal humanism of the modern Rousseauians. Others looked elsewhere for their conservative traditions. Some looked outside of our tradition, to Burke, for instance, for those roots, a search that had the advantage of finding the precursor of American thought and an important figure in conservative thought, as Yuval has pointed out. Others looked southward, mostly in terms of culture and literature, for tradition. Others looked to economic thinkers. Think of Hayek and the ideas brought in from European economic thought. For good or for ill, the result was that post-Civil War conservative thinking was unsure of its grounds and unable to make a consistent and rigorous defense of limited constitutional government in the face of that progressive attack. This had the effect of leaving the field, that is, the battle over the meaning of America's political tradition, to the left, both in terms of political leadership and intellectual thought. The political leadership was folks like Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. The intellectual thought, we think of the progressive historians especially, people like Carl Becker, Frederick Jackson Turner, Charles Beard, Vernon Parrington. As late as 1955, Lewis Hart wrote that conservatism was un-American. Foreign to the American tradition, he associated only with European feudalism. The only tradition in America, he believed, was liberalism, by which he meant a very strict Lockean liberalism that led to, and could only lead to, modern political liberalism. Nevertheless, from the very beginning, when the conservatives began a movement to respond to the rise of liberalism, they instinctively sought to reestablish their ties from an intellectual tradition that preceded America to a tradition emanating from America itself. Enter Russell Kirk and the conservative mind. In this book, and going back and rereading it, I see a man of letters. Not necessarily an expert on American political thought, he made no claim to that. A man of letters, a great man of letters, drawn more towards, shall we say, the poetry in a Platonic sense than Aristotle in the political sense, coming to know and looking to and learning about those American political thinkers. And that's the part of the book I want to focus on. He's looking at the American Revolution through his critique of the French Revolution. based on his understanding of Burke and the beginnings of that movement. He sees the American Revolution as a conservative restoration about the rights of Englishmen, as opposed to the French one about radical ideas and egalitarianism. The real revolution in America, he says, occurred in 1800 with the Jeffersonians and the leveling spirit of the Republicans. So in his first chapter on the Americans, he talks a little bit about Alexander Hamilton, Fisher Ames, who's a little too pessimistic for Russell, and even John Marshall at the end a bit, but his central figure is, of course, John Adams. Adams, who writes about moral equality, not egalitarianism, and that out of that gets a theory of aristocracy that existed by nature, a concept, interestingly enough, that Adams shared with Thomas Jefferson. Liberty is appreciated by not everyone, shall we say, and Adams favored prescriptive liberties, not abstractions. And he favored individuality, but not, and actually he abhorred individualism. Adams was the real conservative, the figure he found closest to Edmund Burke, except for two things. One was an attachment to the crown. The other one was the establishment of religious liberty. But of course, these were two key events in the American founding that distinguish the British tradition from the American tradition, but also, for that matter, the French Revolution from the American. It was in the First Continental Congress, of course, that Adams was the key figure in precisely that argument, and an argument laid out in their records of the debate, shifting from the rights of Englishmen away from common law, away from other appeals to the arguments for America's founding, to an appeal to the rights of nature, or the nature of things, as he said. And of course, it was also Adams in the Second Continental Congress who got the Declaration written and through. Adams was a Republican, not in the partisan sense, but in the sense of Republican government. He believed in democracy moderated by institutions. Adams is a good pick. I actually like John Adams quite a bit. He's a central figure of the American founding. But it leaves me wondering, what about some of the others? Now, I am actually a critic in most ways, actually in many ways similar to Russell Kirk's of Mr. Jefferson. But having said that, how about James Madison? Or my favorite, George Washington. George Washington, by these standards, is clearly a conservative. I don't raise this as a criticism of what was not said in this book, but more as an opening. This is the beginning of a conversation about those founders. I think Kirk, in his time, at that stage of conservatism, was in many ways himself largely influenced by progressive historians who had so trashed the American founders, literally, and thrown them under the bus, that turn and the extent to which he made it, I think, was a major establishment and a movement in reestablishing that scholarship. In his second chapter on the Americans, focusing on John Randolph and John C. Calhoun, here I do see what Kirk is trying to do in his discussion about John C. Calhoun, but I regret that it has actually hurt him and his case to some extent. That is, Russell Kirk never was a defender of slavery, and he was always wrongly associated with the Southern cause. Wrongly, I think, and unfairly. This is a Northern man. But that argument, I think, feeds some of his critics. He writes mostly, and he's interested in the argument that Calhoun presents about the concurrent majority as a backstop or a break against radical democracy. But as a result, he refers to Adams and Calhoun as the two most eminent American political writers in history. I think that probably goes too far. The argument that Kirk wants to make against that argument about democracy, the need to break it up, is actually, in my opinion, better made by James Madison himself through structural federalism and the structures of the U.S. Constitution. And I think that turn would have strengthened his argument quite a bit and not have associated Kirk with the arguments of Calhoun, which it's virtually impossible to separate his arguments for nullification, secession, and concurrent majority with his defense, very positive defense of slavery later. I also mark as a footnote, given Yuval's reference to Lincoln, some beautiful things that Russell Kirk wrote, an essay 1954, I'm thinking of particular, that speaks of Lincoln as a conservative statesman of a high order. That is, as he's going through and thinking these things through and looking for that conservative tradition, he's also grappling with and coming to know these figures. And I think there's actually more there than immediately meets the eye. He observes that what Lincoln represented was someone, a great conservative, because he saved the Union, but also because he was a long way from Jacobin abstractions, as he says, rooted in American ideas emanating from the founders. So anyway, to jump ahead, the American mind, I think, begins the conversation Russell Kirk is having with America. He writes in that book, and then he elaborates these ideas more so in another book, The American Cause, in 1957. There he talks about how the Americans have always exhibited a conservative cast of mind, following Judeo-Christian moral precepts, the classical tradition, but that they established a system based on equality and natural rights, rights to which men are entitled by nature, he says. He also laid out the classic conservative distinction between the French Revolution and the moderate American Revolution. And then he does that even more so in The Roots of American Order in 1974. The American Revolution here is now becoming vastly different from the French, which was meant to completely overthrow the old order. America's expectations were moderate, founded on sound apprehension of nature and rights. Their constitutions were Republican and conservative. The Declaration here is now talked about as a document grounded in natural law, based on truths that flowed from the nature of things. Kirk's language actually changes through the course of these books. And it wasn't just the traditional conservative Russell Kirk who was pointing in this direction. I think of Hayek's work, not only The Road to Serfdom, but more importantly in his book, The Constitution of Liberty, pointing towards Madison's constitutionalism. And of course, Frank Meyer, in many ways, points to the ideas of the American founding as his source of American fusionism. I would add a few more of these things to, I think, this trend towards a proper understanding of Americanism. One, I think there's been a growing agreement that the radical changes in America, lamented by conservatives, did not stem from America itself, nor even from the Civil War, but really from the progressives. A large body of scholarship has gone into that in great length, ranging from Forrest McDonald to the Claremont conservatives within conservatism. Secondly, there has been a massive rise of very good conservative scholarship on that era. I noted Forrest McDonald's destruction of Charles Beard's work, but also the entrance under the field of the Straussians, sometimes critics of Russell Kirk, actually I think here on the same team. Third, I would note how the rise of the Warren Court and its radicalness has driven conservatives to try to reassess and establish a ground to make an argument about original intent constitutionalism, and how the work by people like Russell Kirk have fed that, but the scholarship extended well beyond that. Fourth, the rise of Ronald Reagan and his more practical arguments about conservatism grounded in American ideas, his call for a second American Revolution. From that directly follows, I think, the Tea Party sentiment, not necessarily in political practice, but in idea of looking back to the Declaration, the Constitution, to an American tradition, which is defendable very forcefully. So just to conclude very briefly, Kirk is a great defender of tradition, about preserving and reforming. The questions, however, sometimes demand that we think through those reforms in times of great challenge. The American Revolution was one of those moments in which the time the American founders referred back to first principles, as they said. So was the controversy over slavery in the work of Abraham Lincoln, which is a deep violation of humanity through slavery. This demands the ability to make principled distinctions between various traditions in order to be prudent in the full meaning of that word, which requires, at some level, an appeal to reason. The debate today, I think, is one of those times. The progressive assault has been very powerful, We need to appeal back to an American tradition and have a profoundly powerful agenda that is philosophically grounded in an idea of truth, but also the structural things that the founders give us. And in that attack, the patriot, Russell Kirk, in wanting to come to the defense of America, would passionately say yes. The question about which America, which conservatives like to debate at great length, I think we need to look at Kirk, the full breadth of his scholarship, but also the continuing scholarship about America and various statesmen involved in it for a complete answer to that question. But I don't think Kirk would have come to the conclusion of Fisher-Ames that the game is played out in America and all is lost. So fortunately, 60 years later, I think we stand on the shoulders of his scholarship and the opening he created by that powerful book and the arguments he laid forth so that students like myself and others can continue that work, such that I believe today, 6 years later, conservatism actually does stand on better ground when it comes to this question to withstand the progressive assault and unite a conservatism that can appeal to the better angels of our natures. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event to talk about, as we've heard, a very significant and important book. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished people, and to what they said, I'll simply say dittos. And it's an honor to have you, Mrs. Kirk, here as well. I too come in praise of Russell Kirk and the conservative mind. I suspect that won't surprise anybody here. I greatly admire the body of work, the mind and sensibilities of Dr. Kirk. I have some differences with some of what he stood for, but his contributions to conservatism are undeniably quite impressive. And in important respects, I wish conservatism today was more Kirkian, frankly, than it is, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment. First of all, I did want to say a couple things about, several things about Dr. Kirk. The first of which is he was a beautiful and evocative writer. It was said that he could make dry bones speak to the living, which is a lovely phrase. Kind of a sucker for beautiful writers, and there's a lot to commend him for in that respect. Also his tone, it was temperate and scholarly. He reminded conservatives of their moral heritage. He recognized man's spiritual and social nature. He gave rise to conservatism's intellectual respectability in the post-World War II era. Prior to that, it didn't have much. And he provided a useful corrective to the conservative temptation to atomistic individualism. So these are all things to remember about him, to praise him for, and things we should continue to strive for in any age and era. What I'd like to do is to very briefly highlight three themes that emerge in a conservative mind, each of which are derivative in one way or another, I think, of Edmund Burke, and explain why those insights are still crucial to the health and well-being of conservatism. First, Kirk was a great proponent of prudence. It was his sixth canon of conservative thought. He wrote about the importance of recognizing that, quote, hasty innovations may be a devouring conflagration rather than a torch of progress. Society must alter, for prudent change is the means of social preservation, but a statesman must take providence into his calculations, and a statesman's chief virtue, according to Plato and Burke, is prudence, unquote. Here's how the aforementioned Edmund Burke put it: the lines of morality are not like the ideal lines of mathematics. They admit of exceptions, they demand modifications. These exceptions and modifications are not made by the process of logic, but by the rules of prudence. So prudence, not pugilism, not purity, is the cardinal political virtue. Practical wisdom, practical judgment, the ability to take the appropriate action at a given time and place was considered by the ancient Greeks, by Christian philosophers, and by statesmen like Burke and Lincoln to be of supreme worth and value. A second theme that runs through the conservative mind is the importance of taking into account particular circumstances when applying political principles. Kirk pointed out that Burke based his every important decision upon a close examination of particulars. Burke detested metaphysical politicians and abstractions, by which he meant not principles, but rather vainglorious generalizations without respect for human frailty and the particular circumstances of an age and nation. And so, Kirk argued, principles are necessary, but they must be applied discreetly and with infinite caution to the workaday world. And this leads me to a third Kirkian insight, which is that human nature suffers irremediably from certain faults, that to aim for utopia is to end in disaster, and that we are not made for perfect things, and that all we can reasonably expect is a tolerably ordered, just, and free society in which some evils, maladjustments, and suffering continue to lurk. In other words, we should not expect perfection in a fallen world, not from us and not from others. Which brings me to the here and now. It seems to me that those who travel under the banner of conservatism need to embrace a more genuinely conservative disposition. What that means is appreciating the complexity of human society and the importance of human experience in shaping our approach to contemporary challenges, and recognizing that politics involves prudential and imperfect judgments, which is to say that conservatism is hurt when its adherents treat it as an adamantine ideology, which is quite different from grounding it in enduring principles. An example, during the 2012 GOP primary debate, Fox News' Brett Baer posed a question to 8 candidates on the stage. Say you have a deal, a real spending cuts deal, 10-to-1 spending cuts to tax increases. Who on the stage would walk away from that deal? Can you raise your hands if you feel so strongly about not raising taxes, you'd walk away from a 10-to-1 deal? And each of the 8 candidates raised his or her hand. This was, to me, a bit of a danger sign. I say that not because I favor higher taxes, I don't, but we had reached a point where none of those running for president on a conservative platform could admit to any scenario in which he or she would raise taxes, even if, as a result of doing so, you might roll back the modern welfare state. I would just point out that Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, instituted the largest tax increase of any governor at that point in history. And as president, he instituted the highest tax increase of anyone in history. Now, I'm not arguing that that was right, or even that Reagan didn't regret it. But there is a warning sign in terms of holding that up as a standard and saying that anybody that crosses it is therefore to be written off. No new taxes is fine as a goal. It is certainly a reasonable starting point in negotiations. It might even be the right end point, but to elevate it to an inviolate principle and to insist that politicians take pledges opposing tax increases under any and all circumstances strikes me, at least, as misguided. Taxation is always a balancing process when it needs to be seen in the context of specific economic conditions and other possible gains. For example, no responsible conservative would forego reforming Medicare, which is the main driver of our fiscal crisis, by injecting competition and choice into a system in exchange for slightly higher taxes on the top income earners in America. Every political movement, including conservatism, faces the danger of elevating certain policies into catechisms and failing to take into account new circumstances. When that occurs, we lose the capacity to correct ourselves. Conservatism, at least as I understand it, ought to be characterized by an openness to evidence and a search for truth, not an attachment to a rigid orthodoxy. If there's any political viewpoint in this world which is free from slavish adherence to abstraction, Ronald Reagan said in 1977, it is American conservatism. What I'm talking about then is a conservative temperament, which affects everything from tone to intellectual inquiry to compromise. It champions principles in flexible, reasonably flexible ways that includes a straightforward evaluation of facts. To put things in a slightly different way, conservatives need to reacquaint themselves with the true spirit of conservatism, which is reform-minded, empirical, anti-utopian, and somewhat modest in its expectations. It doesn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. It doesn't treat political opponents as enemies. and it isn't in a state of constant agitation. Winsomeness actually goes a long way in politics, it turns out. Let me say one last word about what I see as a troubling development within some quarters of conservatism. There are figures within modern conservatism who thrive on relentless confrontation and who, in the words of Reagan, want to go over the cliff with all flags flying. To be sure, such individuals can be a source of energy to a political party. They can also serve the purpose of stiffening spines when that's needed. They may even be on the correct side of many public policy issues. Yet it does strike me that in a deep sense, they don't possess a conservative disposition or even a particularly conservative outlook in the world, on the world. Rather, they have reinterpreted conservatism in order to fit their own temperament, which seems to be in a near constant state of irritation, ever alert to identify and excommunicate from the ranks those that they perceive as apostates. And here's where this mindset eventually leads. A best-selling conservative author, an influential voice, is now describing the effort to defund the Affordable Care Act, which even its advocates admit cannot succeed given the current political alignment, as a litmus test. Those who oppose this effort are not simply wrong, they are in their own way, quote, endorsing tyranny, unquote. The debate, we're told, is a binary one. You are either for liberty or you are for tyranny, nothing in between. Now let's assume that you agree with the approach of Ted Cruz and company, as intelligent and principled people do. Still, to elevate a tactical difference with no substantive importance into an apocalyptic battle of the ages as a hinge point in human history is, how should I put this, slightly exaggerated, hyperbolic, extreme, the product of what Burke might call an intemperate mind. In my estimation, to do this, to put this kind of frame around a tactical disagreement isn't wise, it's not prudent, it's not conservative, and it's not the kind of thing, the kind of mindset that I would think that Russell Kirk, based on the conservative mind, would find appealing. Now, the interpretation of conservatism by people like Burke and Kirk were not written on stone tablets delivered on Mount Sinai, and even if they were, merely to invoke their names doesn't mean that one is properly applying their insights to contemporary challenges. But it does strike me that as this debate intensifies, and as various people lay claim to being the true conservative, it's worth reminding ourselves what some of the greatest exponents of conservatism actually believed. Thank you for hosting me, and for Heritage for devoting this event to a great and consequential book and a very, very impressive man. Thanks very much.
Before turning to the audience for questions, and we do have someone who will give you a microphone, and we'd appreciate if you would speak into that when you're asking a question. Just two comments. Number one, that Russell Kirk said over and over again, wrote, and I'm sure it must be there in the conservative mind, is that conservatism is not an ideology. That is something he felt really, really strong about, that it may be a philosophy, and you can qualify that, but he made it very, very clear that conservatism is not an ideology. Just a little fact, Peter, I'm sure you know this, but that Ronald Reagan did cut taxes when he was the governor of California. He did it because he was required to do so. Raise taxes, the largest income tax increase in state history, because he had to, he had to balance the budget. But then he cut taxes, and in equal to, as a matter of fact, more than he raised them when he first came in as governor of California. Having said that, please, turning to the audience, questions, please. And
hi, I'm no Amy Emery of the Weekly Standard and the DC Examiner. You seem to talk and act as if the liberal mind and the conservative mind and the traditions were two distinct and kind of opposed entities. I kind of wonder how you account for the large number of people who at one time in their lives sort of thought of themselves as liberals and became conservatives later on. I mean, starting with Reagan and so many people who were associated with him, such as the Crystals and Jean Kirkpatrick and Michael Novak, whose book I'm now reading and enjoying immensely because his trajectory and his journey was so much like my own. No, and I also know that a number of people at the APPC are quite ardent fans of Robert F. Kennedy. So there is, who I regard as kind of close to Jack Kemp in a lot of ways. And I feel that there's sort of a lot more kind of overlap and subtlety than these divisions will necessarily accept.
I'll start to make an argument that I think I would say on the one hand and on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right that politics and these kinds of distinctions don't lend themselves to binary positions, whether they're political binary or observations of where people are coming from. I think one of the beauties of conservatism, and here I think this is a break with liberalism, is that conservatives believe that the mind is capable of having rational thoughts and having and kind of thinking through these things, as opposed to the liberal mind, which is much more rigorous in terms of finding scientific answers as they go through. So I think there's a much larger array of people, and I think, and you see it in Kirk's book and other people kind of come to and go through a process of thinking through to come to their positions. Absolutely, nothing is set in stone. Having said that, I would say, however, that in the array of American political thought, especially, I think it's very apparent, but I think it's more broadly true than that, but especially in American political thought, the gap between what I would broadly group as the American tradition, meaning the founders' traditionalism, including Lincoln, and modern progressivism, that gap is grounded in the philosophical rejection of the truth, and in everything that America really stands for by the left, is vast, and I think if we don't recognize that picture, we're missing the forest for the trees. I think what conservatism is about is figuring that out, and over time, you're trying to figure out how you grapple, how do you do something about that in actual politics.
Well, I would just add, it's important to see also that conservatives and liberals are both arguing about America, and so it shouldn't surprise us that people are able to move from one to the other. In a certain sense, they're both defending some understanding of America and of what's best about it. And as people think through their ideas, and as people have different life experiences, as people come to understand what American politics is about in different ways, they do move from left to right. But the early Michael Novak is not a radical leftist. The early Michael Novak is quite recognizable as a person of a conservative temperament with conservative priorities who thinks that the right doesn't have the right goals, the right ideals in mind. And I think he would say that he came over time to see that actually the right did or could, and he saw himself as a kind of corrective to a certain sort of conservatism. That happens sometimes in the other direction too. The early Irving Kristol is not, in fact, a Trotskyite. That's a kind of easy story to tell, but it's just not true. The priorities that people have, don't begin again from scratch. They set you on a course of understanding and discovery and intellectual exploration that can lead you to a different intellectual position. But that doesn't mean that there's not a very profound difference between what amounts to the left and the right in America. They're obviously not just simply clear, entirely separate denominations of people, but they do stand for different ways of thinking about human life.
Milton Grenfell, it has been, I think, wisely said that he who controls the past controls the future. So I want to go back to Lincoln for a moment. I think many people argue that, yes, he did save the Union, but he destroyed the Republic. What do you make of Lord Acton's remarks to Robert E. Lee after Appomattox? When he wrote, he said, I saw your cause. It's not the destruction of democracy, but its redemption. And I mourn for more what was lost at Appomattox, and I rejoice over what was won at Waterloo. And he said that he felt that a government that was unrestrained by the right of secession, the central power, there would be no stop to its growth in power. And we certainly have seen that happen in our trajectory since then. So can we really discount the arguments, the anti-Lincoln arguments? And are we giving too much credit to what Lincoln really unleashed, which was a growth of the central state, which has not stopped?
I think again, that's a perfect example of how I think coming to understand what historically actually happened is crucial. I mean, the assumption is that Lincoln's actions led directly to the rise of the modern state. When in actuality, and actually Heritage put out a study on this, looking at who was the true father of big government, Lincoln or Woodrow Wilson. The answer really is, which when you look at the budgets, the people, the numbers, it really is the progressives. That's where you see a radical change in the nature of how you understand government. Lincoln, despite his debates we always like to have about whether he should have suspended habeas corpus or 5 or 6 other things, wanted to do those things in order to save the Union, by which he meant going back to the constitutional limits on government. Whether that included your right to secession, I think, is a legitimate constitutional question, which I think Lincoln and Madison before him were right on that as a constitutional question. But the larger question, I think, here, I think the decisive piece is that conservatives need to kind of get over this sense that somehow Lincoln caused the problem. We can debate all the different pieces along the way. Do we like Jackson? Do we like Lincoln? Do we like Jefferson? But again, I mean, the radical shift in politics, which Kirk both, I think, understood and saw, but also was himself influenced by, was the rise of these more radical ideas, which he saw coming out of the French Revolution. But they found their way into America through the progressive movement that radically changed how constitutional government worked, but also brought into it a philosophical grounding which directly went after the principles, the moral principles of our politics.
I agree with what Matt said. I do think that there's a flaw in the understanding of who's responsible for what. I'd also, I guess, add a cautionary note in terms of this notion of the trajectory of the state and how problematic it is. I mean, I have my own problems in terms of how large government is, particularly because of the last five years. But it is worth keeping in mind that the 20th century created what was the most powerful nation in history and the greatest and most glorious nation in history, which was a tremendous force for good. And sometimes I wonder if conservatives speak as if this has been a kind of unremitting downward trajectory, when in fact I don't think that that's the case. And the reality is that we're a much different country than we were in the 19th century. And you do, I think, along the lines of, in the spirit of conservatism, need to adjust to those kinds of things. And then you need to refine programs as they come up, which I think conservatives, responsible conservatives like Paul Ryan right now, are trying to do. But I do think it's worth bearing in mind what Lincoln achieved and what America has achieved post Lincoln. I just wanted to say very quickly in response to Lee, just for the record, and one clarification, I guess, on Reagan. I am familiar with Reagan's record. He is to me a political hero and was the formative influence in my life. And you're right about the taxes that went up in California. Of course, he raised TEFRA taxes when he was president, when he wasn't compelled to do so. But my point was not that Reagan's record called him into question, because I think on the tax question he was fantastic. I mean, his supply side revolution changed the course of economics, and I think that the economic arc and trajectory of America. My point is just a simple one, which is I am wary about setting up what I think is, or want to guard against, a kind of mindset which I think is more prevalent now than it has been in the past, which is if you cross the line of raising taxes, you're somehow disqualified. You know, I hear this all the time, and people bring it up, and I just don't think that that's a responsible way. My own preference on these things, and I do think it's more of a conservative approach, would be you take people in the totality of their acts. You look at what the circumstances were when they did it. You allow for some degree of imperfection and mistakes. And if we develop a mindset in which, when people kind of cross these lines, or what are perceived as sacrosanct lines, that does concern me.
Well, I think, Peter, that Russell would agree with you. Might also, with regard to Lincoln, urge those of you who would like to read another book by Russell Kirk, which Matt made reference to, The Roots of American Order. And there is a section in there about Lincoln by Russell, in which he lauds President Lincoln for saving the Republic. And I think it's a worthy little essay, which I recommend for your reading. Next question, please.
Dave Demirbalek, Office of Senator Tom Coburn. 60 years ago, when The Conservative Mind was published, the Episcopal Church was known as the Republican Party at prayer. A lot of the central figures in the Conservative Mind, Edmund Burke, chief among them, were Anglicans, Church of Ireland. But flash forward to today, the WASP establishment is, if not disappeared, it's on its way out. And especially among my peers in the millennial generation, I noticed that most of my fellow conservatives are either Catholic or evangelical. So I was wondering what effect you might think this would have on the future of the conservative movement. Russell Kirk writes that the conservative is concerned with the order of the soul, I believe, in the conservative mind. So I was wondering if this has any effect at all, in your opinions.
I'm probably the least. As a Jewish conservative, I wish there were more Jewish conservatives. Might live in Florida, I guess.
I would just I think you just vote more often.
Fair enough.
I would just make one observation that comes to mind when you're, because that's obviously a much larger question having to do with demographics and all sorts of things. One is that I think the early Protestantism, the kind of early religiosity of conservatism, if you will, that was what we might call a tradition. That was the remnant of a healthy culture that had shaped that for some time. That could only last so long, and it didn't kind of recreate itself, shall we say. I find it is no coincidence today that serious religious thinking, and this is not a criticism of others, but it's no coincidence that Catholicism, which has a natural law tradition, and serious thinkers in the Jewish faith, which has its own intellectual traditions, which are philosophical, and that element of Protestantism that is looking towards almost kind of a similar natural law reasoning. I find it no coincidence that those are the places that are the strengthest, that we feel the strength and the health of conservative thinking in that area, precisely because tradition qua tradition can't last unless it's regenerated. And we're seeing the regeneration from those religious faiths, those aspects of religious faiths that take ideas and the grounding of ideas and morality and philosophy seriously. So I think that actually proves the point.
I would just add a cautionary note about 60 years ago and the Episcopalians, and that is that at the time the leading political arm of the establishment, Protestant establishment, was the National Council of Churches, which was liberal, progressive, and very much not conservative. So it's we got to be a little bit careful about characterizing and emphasizing too much the Episcopal influence on thinking and writing of the day. Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Michael Crone. I'm a graduate student with some policy interests, but I'm actually in mathematics. So in terms of this discussion I'm going to have regarding, absolutes versus relatives, I should preface it by saying, well, I work in absolutes, but I understand that in the real world you don't have them. But in terms of the success of an idea, my take coming in is that the politicians that I'm suspicious of, when they cave, they're worried about the success of themselves over the success of the idea. If you look, say, at McGovern, or if you look at Ron Paul, you see political candidates that stood firm even when, as a candidate, you would think it started to get pretty clear that, this idea was not going to win in this election, but whose ideas gained traction over the long term because they stood firm for them. And so when we look at, talking about that in terms of the perfect being the enemy of the good, It, I'm getting more of a comment than a question, but I guess I'm looking for your response on, isn't there a problem? I mean, even the 68 Democratic Convention, the biggest thing that I hear of as remembered for political strife related to, you know, the hippies was aimed at the Democrats. And I think there is strategic value to that. And I'd like your response to that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I think there's something to what you said, but the issue of several caveats, as you might imagine. I'm not in principle against people standing up and fighting for an idea that may even be, at any moment in time, a losing idea or a losing cause. It really depends on what the nature of the fight is. So these things are very hard, frankly, to judge in the abstract. I would say, for example, that you mentioned George McGovern. Let's take him as an example. He did stand up for his view of America and what he believed to be the embodiment of modern liberalism. That had several effects. One was a 49-state landslide defeat. Second was the exodus of people that Noemi Emory was referring to, people like Bill Bennett and Jeane Kirkpatrick and Irving Kristol and Michael Novak. That was not alone the reason that they left, but that was a contributing cause, because a lot of people who were part of the Democratic Party saw McGovern in 1972 and said, this is a much more radical party and a much more radical movement that I'm comfortable with. And it really took until 20 years later, and Bill Clinton, who ran in many respects against a kind of McGovernism, though he himself worked on the McGovern campaign when he was young. I tend to be somebody that believes you can do more when you're in power than when you're out of power. And I think Reagan proves that as well. He was more influential than Goldwater by a long shot, and he influenced people like me and others. In part because he won and he was president, and he had a chance to implement those ideas that went into effect. That doesn't mean that Barry Goldwater didn't serve a useful purpose, and indeed, Reagan became famous, as you probably know, during the Goldwater campaign when he gave the famous speech in 1964. I think these things work together. I don't think Ron Paul is going to be a significant, at least I hope he's not going to be viewed as a significant figure in conservatism when all is said and done. His son, however, might be. And I think his son actually is probably, to get back to that word again, more prudent than his father. But there is a place for gadflies, for people who are willing to hold the flag and even go over the edge. You just don't want everyone going over with them.
I'll add something very brief to that, which is, I think, one of the things that Kirk was excellent in pointing out, but is a truth, is that politics is not precision. It is not math. It's not a science. What that means is it demands certain individuals who are capable of making the best decisions they can in the circumstances. And they should be informed by their tradition, by certain principles, meaning first principles, knowing well what the conditions in which they make the decision are. That's this idea of prudence, which calls for statesmanship. I think that concept of prudence, which Kirk did amazing things to try to revive this tradition of prudence, is something we are desperately in need of today. And I think the mistake we have today is that when someone understands a principle, they assume that automatically determines the practice. When in actuality, a principle is merely a guide. It still demands that prudential decision-making in action. And I think if this body of work and others that can work towards the recovery of that idea, so that we no longer think of prudence as being either a prude or by definition being a moderate, because a prudent man like a Lincoln can be very bold for principled reasons. Right? If we can provide that sense of prudence at the heart of conservatism, I think that would be a major contribution and something that we can look back to the grounds laid by Kirk.
Let me add one thought to that. To stand up for the perfect a little bit. It's true the perfect can be the enemy of the good, and the perfect must not be allowed to become the enemy of the good, which means we have to be careful not to confuse means with ends and theory with practice. But the perfect should be the guide of the good, the lodestar of the good. Prudence has to be guided by some idea of what the difference is between good and bad. And that idea is not going to be a practical idea. It's more likely going to be a notion of the right. Now, it can't be imported directly into politics, and when it is, it's not particularly useful in practical everyday decision-making. But it can be useful in setting the bounds of public argument. It can be useful in suggesting that there is more than prudence to politics, that it's not pure prudence, it's not pure pragmatism, which in practice usually just amounts to accepting some premises without thinking about them and then pursuing them, which is basically what modern progressivism wants us all to do, to assume that it is purely pragmatic and is just pursuing certain kinds of practical ends. In order to get around that, in order to defeat that, you do have to think about what is best, not just about what is good. But in order to pursue that, to move in that right direction, you do have to be able to tell the difference between the perfect and the good, and you have to be able to compromise. Compromise is not a bad thing. It is the only way to get some movement in the right direction. And so there are times, many times in practical politics, when extremism in defense of liberty is a vice. It is a very great vice. It is our vice. And we have to be careful about that. But that's because there's a difference between thinking about politics and acting in politics. Our action has to be guided by thinking that has a pretty clear idea of what the goal is, of what the good is. But it also has to be guided by a sense of what you can achieve right now and what the difference is between moving a little bit in the right direction and moving a little bit in the wrong direction. So these things have to coexist. The coexistence is never going to be easy. These two ways of thinking are always going to not think very well of one another, but they just have to be there at the same time, and we have to find some sort of balance between them.
I can't resist adding in here that Russell Kirk backed, defended, supported Barry Goldwater in 1964. As a matter of fact, he wrote a speech or more for him, at least one that I can think of, a very excellent one, at Notre Dame. Wasn't it at Notre Dame? Yes. Russell Kirk backing Barry Goldwater, how could it be? In the particular circumstance of 1964, and with the arc of the conservative movement beginning to take off from the 1950s to the 1960s and on, Russell Kirk and other conservatives saw that there was a need to look at the perfect, to raise that. And I think that Yuval's phrase here, the perfect should be the guide of the good, is marvelous. And I think that's something that young people should take to heart. And I'm also reminded of what a very wise politician once said. He said, sometimes you win by losing. And that's precisely what happened with Barry Goldwater. And as Peter pointed out, coming out of that was Ronald Reagan and a lot of other things as well, including the end of the Cold War without firing a shot. Well, we're at 1:12. Am I getting a sign? One more question, perhaps?
Thank you. Kelly Kullberg with the Veritas Forum and Christians for a Sustainable Economy. I would love any wisdom. I feel that the weakening of the church in relation to the conservative movement is not inevitable, that it's been strategized, and there are even progressives teaching sort of 527s and 501s how to use Bible language for rather disingenuously. We know that Mr. Soros has been funding a number of these projects. It's confused a lot of Christians, and I think that's the point. Do you have any advice about reconnecting the sort of branches to the true vine with a interest in a search for truth and in the true, the good, and the beautiful? that would naturally flourish within the church.
That sounds like an ethics public policy question. But I would say briefly, just before they give you the real answer. I think part of that history, which is now playing out in a very problematic way, is again early 20th century. The progressives set out the objective of taking over large aspects of religion in America, especially through the then established institutions of Protestant religion. The national various councils and things they had in their crosshairs at the beginning. The idea of and they kind of had a whole theory of this, how to interpret the Bible, how progress influences religion, and all this. And you see it playing out over the course of the 20th century, intellectually and morally in large swaths of American religion. And that is a fact. Having said that, I do think that Kirk and others, and we see this, I think religion in America is vibrant in certain areas for two reasons. One is there is a natural yearning to know the truth about things that cannot be wiped out by progressivism, which is why in the end they've failed on that front. But having said they're doing very well to try as best they can. And the other thing is I think that conservatism leaves open the door to pursue those things, and especially given its interest in protecting religious liberty, I think offers the greatest promise for renewal of those things. But we do need to have, I think, a very powerful criticism of the progressive impulse and what it means, and in turn, a very powerful understanding of what is this kind of the seed, the cultural seed, to which we want to appeal, that appeals to human nature in a way that will kind of bring that out.
I would say one way to think about this is to think about the question of what the purpose of politics really is. And on the left, the answer to that question tends to be that the purpose of politics is to transform society in line with some understanding of social justice, to recreate the relationships that make up society. I think conservatives tend to think, and Kirk painted this picture just beautifully, that the purpose of politics is to create and sustain a space in which people can live thriving lives. That means that politics doesn't have one direction. It's not aiming at an ideal end state. It responds to pressures in society that push in different directions, and so sometimes it leans one way and sometimes another, but its goal is always to sustain that space. And what happens in that space is the moral lives of real people. What happens in that space, the space between the individual and the state, is society, is the most important thing about society. And the left tries to wipe out that space between the individual and the state. It's easy for us to mistake that for a kind of collectivism, even to call it a kind of communitarianism, because there's a sense in which they want to wipe out the individual. But really, what it's about is a very radical individualism, in which there are only individuals and one large body above them. Conservatism believes that what really matters in life happens between those two things, happens between the individual and the state, in the family, in the community, and in institutions and organizations, including religious ones, especially religious ones, that try to guide the moral lives of human beings. And so in thinking about how to approach the relationship between religion and politics, to me, that question and the idea of religious liberty speaks to the need to sustain that space between the individual and the state, and to use politics where you can to sustain that space, to use politics to limit the reach of politics. That is a kind of description of what political conservatism amounts to. And to me, as a member of a minority religion, it's absolutely essential to sustain that. What we mean by religious liberty is really freedom from the power of others to command you on the highest things, to determine for you what matters most. And so I think if you're trying to see what the place of politics is in shaping and organizing the kind of moral life you're after, I think the place of politics is in sustaining that space. That sometimes means government should do things. Sometimes it means government should restrain from doing things. But that's not the essential question. The essential question is, what is the goal? What are you after? And I think sustaining that space where thriving lives can happen is the purpose.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I quite agree with Yuval, and back to what you were asking about the church, and here I speak as a person of the Christian faith. Once that space is created, and you have to fight to keep that space, then the church has to be the church. It's not a political institution or a political organization. And actually I've written a book on this, but I have concerns when faith and politics get too closely joined together, in part, frankly, mostly because of what I think it can do to faith. And the church needs to be the church, which is to speak for moral truths and to help build decent and moral lives, but also to be there to heal the brokenhearted, and to help people who are facing hardships and sorrow. I thought Pope Francis spoke actually quite beautifully about that the other week in this interview that was released. And to create a community of people, believers, who care about each other, and uplift one another. If the church can do that, I think a large part of politics will take care of itself in all sorts of ways. That doesn't mean that individual believers certainly shouldn't be involved in politics, or even at certain moments that the church shouldn't be involved, although I think that those instances are very rare, and I'd be cautious about it. But the founders understood, like many others, that self-government, a republic, depended on people who had, to some degree or another, virtuous lives. And I do think that religious institutions should have some bearing on that, and should pay some amount of attention to it.
I think that Russell Kirk would probably say, in answer to your question, let us raise up as best we can the little platoons of society, which is really what we're talking about, isn't it? A family, community, church, and those voluntary associations that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about as well. I know that if Russell were here today, he would say something like, well done, well done. And would you please join me in thanking this really extraordinary panel?